My guest today is Sonya Dixon. Sonya is the founder of Sterling Classical School up in North Austin. Sterling is a Socratic method classical education private school that was founded back in 2008. In this conversation, we talk a lot about Sonya's background, when she felt like she wanted to get into education, which was very, very early at the age of 10. We talked about her experience with overparenting with some of her students who have helicopter parents. We talked about the importance of reading development, particularly early in a child's development in kindergarten and first grade. We talk about what happened during the COVID years at the school and how they were able to get through it and see some of the trends coming that enabled them to grow when other schools weren't. We talked about mentorship, the importance of being a mentor and having a mentor, and many, many other topics. So with that said, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Sonya Dixon.
It interrupts the flow.
Totally
sure.
interrupts the flow. Yeah. Have you done a lot of this kind of stuff before? I Googled you.
Not on podcast or anything, but I've had a lot of like roundtable things that like ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, SCL, Society of Classical Learners, we were regular attenders at those conferences for many years, especially the first 10. And so before the conference starts, the pre-conference is all for administrators. So it's a lot of roundtable and talking, and there's not many schools that are in the same kind of niche that Sterling is, but it's still really interesting to see the commonalities between issues facing.
It's kind of a focus group.
Yeah.
Are you a doctor?
No.
Are you working on a doctorate?
I am not.
Do you have any interest in that?
I have thought about that, and especially a lot the last couple of years. But when I look at my only interest at this point in getting a doctorate would be to teach higher ed. I do have a desire. I feel like at some point, kind of a little bit of a leading to go into working with like future educators to kind of fill in some of those gaps that I don't think that our colleges are addressing in the education realm.
When you introduce yourself to somebody, how do you introduce yourself?
I usually introduce myself as like a founder of Sterling Classical School. And then I serve in the head of preschool and grammar school role, although I'm more intricately involved in like our reading assessment, reading intervention program, like establishing that in the context of a private school, which is usually absent in a lot of private schools.
Do you still teach?
I don't teach in the classroom. I work with students sometimes outside of school just because that's my area of passion. So I probably work with 5 or 6 students now that are all over the United States, like not necessarily here, because that also, I'm a data-driven person, so I love to see how our educational system is measuring up in other states, or if it's just Texas problems, but it's universal in the area of reading for sure. And so it's interesting because I'm working with a lot of like 7th and 8th graders that can't read.
That can't read at all.
Can't read or reading on like a kinder first grade level, but
really?
They've made it to 8th grade.
Wow.
And so these are parents that are looking for answers, and they're tired of seeing their child struggle, and they're not getting answers in their traditional school system. So I did step back in the classroom about 3 years ago now for a year. And that was my favorite year by far. I went back to first grade for a year.
Really?
And loved it. And it really helped define, like, that's where my heart still is in the teaching piece. And it also made me a firm believer that every administrator, at least once every 5 years, should go back in the classroom for 6 months to a year.
It's almost like an anti-sabbatical.
Yep.
Like actually go back and do the thing.
Yeah. And then you earn, the right to talk about what's expectations are in the classroom because you just lived it.
Yeah.
So you're taken more seriously because It's easy to think sometimes those people that sit in the offices have no idea what you're going through in the classroom with kids.
Right.
So if you can speak from your experience or what you just did last year in the same environment that these teachers are teaching in,
Yeah.
there's more buy-in.
That's part of our ethos in our leadership team is you can't ask somebody on your team to do something you're not willing to do yourself.
Yeah.
And so by going in once every couple of years and just proving like, I know what this is like because I just did it.
I just did it.
Gives you a little more street cred with your team.
And the other thing I always offer for my teachers, if I'm trying to or saying we need to be doing this in the classroom and I'm getting pushback, I'm like, I'm happy to go in and model this for you and show you like this is how, like, I don't expect you to figure this out if this seems foreign to you. Sometimes just seeing it in action helps your brain think about, well, I could do it, but I could make some tweaks and this would work for my classroom. Like, I'm happy to model for you, to do whatever and stuff, but the effort has to be there.
I could see you being a teacher of teachers. I could see you being good in that role. I should mention for anybody that watches this, our relationship is not purely business, nor did it start that way.
Right.
So I know you a little bit better than the typical head of school of a client of ours.
Yes.
You are actually, I believe, responsible for me being married to your niece. If I have that story correct.
Yes.
The short version of it that Ashton has told me is, there was an 8-month period where she would not talk to me at all. And despite my best efforts, she wouldn't return a phone call, wouldn't return a text message. And I think it was you that said, hey, whatever happened to that Tanner guy?
Yeah.
And that was the kind of kickback this direction.
Yeah.
So I have to thank you officially on camera so it's recorded for nudging her back my way. It worked out well. Yeah, but you being a teacher of teachers, from what I know of you, feels like a good lane for you to be in.
Yeah, I think that having gone back later to get my master's of education, taking that break in between when I graduated from UT with my early childhood and elementary education degree, and then teaching, being in both public and then switching to a private education, doing homeschool for a little bit. Going back later, it's totally different perspective. And I realized, wow, this was missing at the undergrad level. And I had to go to the graduate level to get some of the things that we should be equipping all teachers for to address this reading crisis we have in the US.
Right.
And so it's super interesting, like Texas implemented that every teacher has to take this science of reading course. So now it's like a 40-hour, you're in cohorts, and it's basically teaching you how to teach reading, but you're the student. So you're learning like the curriculum that we've used at Sterling from the beginning is an Orton-Gillingham-based curriculum. And that's what's used to remediate students with reading difficulties or dyslexia. But all of our students get that because it's just really good instruction for reading.
Just foundational.
It's just foundational and stuff. Because our whole thing at Sterling has always been, we don't want to teach you what to think, we want to teach you how to think. And so we equip all students so they should be able to break down any word and use not only your spelling rules, but your knowledge of phonograms and how our English language works together to be able to spell any word. It's not a memorization thing. It's having the tools in your toolbox to spell it correctly. And so Brent and I and Hadley were all eating in Waco not too long ago, and we were sitting next, we were at this homestead, this like kind of community where they've homesteaded everything out there, and they've turned it into this restaurant. And so the tables were super close together. And I was sitting very close to two ladies, and one was a teacher, and she was saying she was a second grade teacher. So she was complaining to the other individual about having to take the science of reading, which I had researched, and I had realized that, it's Orton-Gillingham is basically what it is. And but in that, she made this comment, and Hadley was like, Mom, I was like, well, she's practically sitting with us, but she said, and who would have thought there's all these like rules of why we spell words the way they were? And I was incredulous, and I looked at Brent and I said, like, you should have known that as a teacher, right? Like, that's who should have known that.
Yeah.
So that's where you see the glaring things missing. You know, University of Texas, one of our best thought of institutions, but I didn't learn anything about teaching reading.
Mm.
I learned an overarching about children's literature and how to structure reading groups and how to group kids and fluency and reading comprehension, but the nuts and bolts of how to teach someone to read, spell, and write was missing. And
Yeah, it's not a deficiency exclusive to public school, too, at least not in our experience. Like, you know as well as anybody what we went through with Lincoln.
Yes,
and when we moved to Bastrop County, we put him in a little private school as like a easy to transition from the school he was at in Austin. And his reading progression really stopped for the better part of the time he was there. And it was because it was all this like self-driven, self-paced, and go sit in the corner and learn to read on your own thing. And for a kid like Lincoln, that's not an option.
Well, and really only about 30% of kids are able to, you're able to show the alphabet and say, okay, your vowels say short and long, these consonants have these sounds, and then they're able to put that together on their own. It's only 30%, but we teach as if it's 100%.
Right.
But the rest of those kids need explicit instruction that builds on each other, loops back around and reviews, builds again.
Yeah.
And they need that very structured, sequential method to really cement it in their brain and to have it. And so, but as a teacher, if you don't know the spelling rules and you don't know that, hey, A actually can make 3 sounds and C is always, you know, a soft C before this, you know, letter. Like, if you don't know how to explain that, then the English language seems very complicated. But for some kids that are very black and white, it's a relief to them to know, hey, there's actually a rule to explain that.
Yeah.
And this is when you apply it. And so it's not a mystery and you don't have to guess.
At what point in your upbringing, so one of the common grounds that you and I had from the get-go was we both went to Hyde Park.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yes.
I mean, you and I have had a lot of shared experience there, and I think we both feel the same way about our time at that school.
Yeah.
When did you go there?
I was there from kindergarten until 5th grade, and then wanted to try public school in Leander. So I did that for 6th, 7th, and then went back from 8th and graduated.
Gotcha. So you spent most of your
school
there.
Yeah. That's all I knew was, I meant, even back then, Miss Gilbert, my kindergarten teacher, was very, everything was phonics based. Like, we learned phonics. I had that base. And so I was always an excellent reader, loved books, excellent speller. Like, that came very natural. And there wasn't that whole language movement, any of that like subsequent, you know, generations went through. So there was a little time, and now we're coming back thinking that's going to solve our crisis. But we have to make sure we've trained people to teach it that way.
Right. Who didn't learn it that way necessarily
to begin with. So they're learning along with the students.
Yeah.
But I have always felt like I was very prepared by my time at Hyde Park, especially in high school. I felt like the literature, everything, like when I went to UT, most of the literature and the novels I had already read in Miss Kelly's class. And we had dissected them and picked them apart and looked at this literary angle. And so I knew how to do literary analysis. I knew how to write papers, no problem.
Yeah.
Like all of those things. So, and I told Dr. Coy when we had coffee together, I said, I feel like Hyde Park did an excellent job preparing me for college. And I felt like other people were shocked and taken back about like writing and doing things, but like to me that was just a natural progression from where I had been.
Yeah. Do you ever talk to any of your teachers from that time? Have you talked to Miss Kelly?
Occasionally on Facebook, her and Miss Morris, the music, because I was in choir and all the plays and all that.
Did you have Miss Kent at all?
I did. Sean was in my grade, her son.
Oh, okay.
And so yes, we did plays, and she was my English teacher, I think, 1 year too.
That's cool.
And stuff.
It's cool to have that common ground.
Yeah.
So you went straight from Hyde Park to UT for your undergrad?
I actually went to A&M for a semester.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Okay.
So I thought I needed to get out of Austin and have a different experience, but then went to A&M and quickly realized like, okay,
College Station wasn't it?
That wasn't it. That, you know, the grass isn't always greener.
Yeah.
And stuff. And so, I transferred back to UT, and then Finished that in about 3.5 years. So I was actually in my first Round Rock ISD kindergarten classroom at 21.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did you know when you graduated high school, did you know you wanted to be a teacher already?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
When was the point in your life where you knew education is going to be my thing?
Probably since I was about 10.
Since you were 10?
Yes, I would get old textbooks and create lesson plans, like full-length lesson plans in every subject.
Oh, what a dork.
And assign up page numbers and everything.
Wow.
Like I knew and never wavered.
God, I'm jealous of people that have that clarity at that age. Like
Yeah.
I had a friend of mine come in who's a preacher, and he
Uh-huh.
was called into ministry at like 15, and he
Oh,
knew
wow.
it at the time. And like
Yeah.
I'm 38 and not
Yeah.
totally sure I know what I want to do.
Well, and the interesting thing is I think about all the different ways I've used my degree because when I started a family and started staying home, then I was a freelancer for an educational publishing company.
Mm.
And so I also loved that. Like I loved looking at strengths and weaknesses in new text coming out up for adoption and creating how did they correlate to our TEKS, our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. So our standards for Texas, like you would have to align curriculum and say, does it cover or meet these objectives? And I loved that part too, and using that to kind of see the backside because I feel like I left. I was super naive starting at 21 in Round Rock,
Mm-hmm.
and definitely naive as far as how the world worked and all of those kinds of things. So we piloted a program for reading and writing, and it was from New Zealand, and the district spent a lot of money, but I was part of this team that piloted it. And so we had people fly in, like trainers that would observe us and do all these things. And they used it for several grades, and then they followed these students, and they were hands above in writing and everything. But eventually, like the program, it didn't get adopted or whatever. And the comment was made, and I was like, we have this data, like we have this data that shows these kids are better writers, like, because it was such a different way. Like it was very much, now a lot of the kids are really instructed to write in a formula, like you do this sentence, you do these, like, so a lot of they don't know their voice, they don't know their opinion, like it's a very rigid format. So a lot of times if you tell students, just write what you think about this, they're like, they're paralyzed. They've never been asked to like free form write or to put their thoughts and to find their own voice or tone into something. And so it's a weakness because for the STAR test and stuff that our students take, it has to be in a certain formula. So
I was going to ask why. So
yes.
That's why.
So teachers are drilling third grades writing STAR. So you need to meet these objectives. Like it's going to be graded on this. Make sure you have this in it. So they're more focused on that than the quality of their words, their writing, their depth, like all of those things. And so we start our kindergartners out like writing narratives about stories, and we'll do different things, and we let them find their voice and their stuff first, and then we do talk about persuasive, but like again, what would you want to persuade? So what's something you feel strongly about? Like we still want them to have their opinions and their voice and learn why they believe what they believe and those kinds of things. And so we had this data, and then someone made the comment like, well, textbook adoption is very political. I had never heard that. And it's like, there's a lot of money involved when whole districts adopt a certain publisher's textbook or things.
Oh.
And that was probably like, my first aha, like, oh, okay, like there's a lot of factors that go into this that have nothing to do with kids' education.
Awareness of the business model.
Yes, exactly.
What was that like when you had that awareness that, oh man, there's a business model to this?
I think it changed the trajectory of the education I wanted for my children.
Okay.
I think that was the moment. I would say there's two moments. It was definitely curriculum choices and how they weren't based on necessarily what was best for students or producing results. And the other one was that last year I taught in Round Rock for kindergarten. We had a waiver, and I had 23 kindergartners, and no aid, no help, and 23, and you were expected
5-year-olds,
and you were expected them to be reading by Christmas or a little after in Round Rock. So,
This is when was this timeline wise?
So this was about 1997.
Okay.
98.
Before Round Rock really exploded.
Yes.
Okay.
And I always say, like, I had a great, like, experience in my particular school. Like, I had a great principal, vice principal, very supportive, and had a great working relationship, all of those things. But I think at some point, and not having kids of my own, I was like, okay, this is like Lord of the Flies. Like, this is crowd control. Because by the time I helped everybody tie their shoes and button their buttons after one bathroom trip, we had killed an hour. And I still had to conference with everybody for writing and for all of those things. And so, and what I noticed is I had this one little boy, and he ended up reminding me a lot of Drew. After Drew was born, because he was painfully shy. So I would, on my clipboard, I would have a note to myself, check on Nathan, and stuff, because he didn't require any attention. Like, I had fires to put out with 23 5-year-olds, right? Yeah. And stuff. And so the ones that were behaving and were not causing any issues and were quiet, like, I had to make a point to check in with him and say, like, how are things going? Like, do you need help with anything?
Yeah, they didn't require your attention, so therefore they didn't get it.
And so then once I had Drew, and he was so painfully shy and would rather somebody not talk to him or look at him. And we peeled him off every Sunday at Sunday school. And I would tell Brent, do not cross the threshold to the door, because it'll be harder to get out. Like, drop and run and stuff. I was like, oh, he's going to be a Nathan. Like, he's going to sit there in a class and not say if he doesn't understand something, not need anything. And so that's when I was like, there has to be a different way. And there has to be another way that you can use the best curriculum that keeps kids engaged, that makes sense, that produces results in the least amount of time required, so they can still be a kid. There has to be a model out there that can accomplish those things. Like, and you know, it's foolish to think one size fits all.
Yeah.
It rarely does.
So when you had that awareness, there has to be a better way to do this. Did you set out to try to find the school that was doing that already?
Yes.
Or at what point did you think, okay, this doesn't exist, I'm going to have to create it?
We started out, so for kindergarten, and first and second and third grade, I homeschooled Drew. And Terry, the other founder of Sterling, she had tried public school 1 year for her oldest in kindergarten, and he was a very active boy, and she was like, okay, this isn't working. And so we were both homeschooling, and then we started an enrichment program for homeschoolers. It's called CEA, Classical Enrichment Academy. So we met 1 day a week, and it ran very much like a school, but it was just 1 day. But parents came and dropped. They didn't stay. And then kids got to rotate classes with same age peers, like we divided them up by grades. So it replicated that school experience with peers. And so you'd have one where you did science experiments, things you really do need to see others' reactions and hear them ask questions that you hadn't thought about. And we did like literature circles where they talked about literature. We did art, we did PE, like all of those things. So they rotated all day long and got to go through all those classes. And so on our second year, Veritas in South Austin had just started, and then there was Faith Academy, and we had looked at those, but it was quite a drive from North Austin. But we both liked the idea of what they were trying to do. And about that same time, some of the parents that we had, because we had about 120 students for the enrichment program, and so
and this is like a bolstering to families that are already choosing to homeschool.
Yeah, they're already homeschooling, but you're giving mamas a day to catch their breath, to do other things, but yet their kids are getting something that they don't have to worry about at home.
And the things that you would want them to get that they benefit from hearing other kids and having that interaction.
Exactly. And so at the end, towards the second year, we had a couple parents come to us and say, would y'all ever consider starting like a hybrid model out here in North? And we were like, oh, I don't know. Like, that seems like a lot. But we kind of looked at things, and Terry and I went away, and we basically put it together in a weekend. And in February 2008 is really when we like incorporated it, got everything, and then we started that August with 50 students.
Wow.
So it was a pretty quick, turnaround. And but we knew that that's what we wanted for our own kids, and we knew that we wanted to go the classical, curriculum route, so that they were learning history in a sequential order, and they were going through a rotation of science, so that by the end of high school they would have visited all different areas of science in depth. So kids would really know more what their interests were, because they would have delved deeper each time
Right.
into biology or physics or chemistry or whatever. And that we were learning history and from the founding fathers, and learning some of our historical documents, and just very rich literature, and looking at it from the humanities perspective. So examining a piece of literature from what was going on in the historical context at that time that novel was written, as well as from a literary, analysis aspect. And just to get that kind of well-rounded, somebody who could think critically, because even then, I don't think we would have been able to tell how much those skills would be needed nowadays.
Yeah.
For the critical thinking, and to be able to take something apart and really examine it from both sides and say, okay, does this line up with what I know? But even at that time, we realized that businesses were prioritizing, critical thinking and thinking outside the box, and they didn't want you just to regurgitate an answer, those kinds of things. And so we wanted that model for our own families, and then we already had this kind of group of families. So most of our beginning 50 students were ones that came over from our enrichment program.
Right.
And parents liked it because, you had options. Your kids didn't have to go 5 days a week. So they still preserved that time that they wanted with them, or shepherding, or they wanted to be involved in what they were learning. They didn't want it to be two separate camps. They wanted to be able to dialogue with their kids about what was happening in the classroom and those kinds of things. And then it really just we started with kindergarten through 5th grade, and then we added 1 grade a year.
At what point did you have the full K through 12 established?
So that was probably like 2014 or 2015. We had our first graduating class.
Gotcha. How many kids were in that class?
In that class, there were, I think, 5.
And what does today's graduating class have?
So Hadley's class has 14.
14.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. And Hadley is the last of the last of
founders.
the Dixon Mohicans.
Yeah, and and most of the teachers, several of the teachers have had all 3 of the Dixon kids, like the English teachers. So that's
cool.
been funny to see they're so different.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned something in here that I actually had written down I wanted to talk to you about. Parent involvement in the kids' education. I'm guessing that there is an ideal, and it probably shifts depending on the family and the kid, what the ideal level of parent involvement would be. But I'm assuming that completely uninvolved leaves a lot to be desired, because you want that parent to be aware of what their kid's learning so they can help bolster stuff at home. But the far end of the spectrum, you have helicopter parents that won't let the kid develop independently, where when they get done with high school, they're completely dependent on the parent to do anything in their continuing ed. What's the happy medium? How do you determine the happy medium?
So what we try to really train our parents and talk to them about from day one is like, you're really a partner or a co-teacher in the grammar school. So K through 4th grade. So you're going to be more involved and needing to help with things, whatever. As they shift to School of Logic, which is 5th through 8th, there is going to be more independence expected of the child, and then your role should be more of a facilitator. So as a facilitator, you're there to steer things if they need help or whatever, but they should be attempting a lot on their own, and you should be teaching them to start being able to communicate for themselves, talk to the teacher, those kinds of things to get clarification. But by 8th and 9th grade, like, we are very clear, like, we don't expect to hear from parents if there's an issue. We expect for the students to email, to ask to talk to the teacher, to come before school. And my thing with all 3 of my kids, I don't know that I've ever emailed one of their high school teachers ever in my life. And my thing is always, I'm not going to college with you. So you try it, you communicate what's going on. And if you can't get a resolution, then come back and I'm happy to brainstorm next steps with you. But this is something you'll have to see through.
Do you ever have to position parents on that? Like, do you ever
Yes.
identify, okay, this parent is over-parenting this kid to the point that it's creating a deficiency for this kid? How does that conversation go?
It's a hard one to
I bet
have,
it's a hard
and
one to
they're
have.
defensive because
I'm
you're
sure.
talking about their most precious beings. But
Yeah, it comes from a good place,
it
right?
comes from a good place. But you have to ask them again and show them that, number one, when you do stuff for your kids or step in and solve something, basically you're communicating to your kids that you don't have confidence or faith in them that they can do it themselves.
Yeah.
So I need to come in and rescue you from this. Instead of saying, you know what, I know you have all the skills and you're equipped to handle this, but if you run into issues or you want to brainstorm, I'm happy to fill that role. Come back and we can talk things out and say, here are your options and what do you think the pros and cons are of these options and which one would you like to attempt next? Like I'm not unapproachable, but I also know that you're fully capable of handling this yourself.
Yeah.
And so we have to get parents to realize, like, you're not intending to send that message, but you're unintentionally sending that message and you're handicapping your child, basically.
Yeah. You're not forcing them to develop their own problem-solving skills, but you're also robbing them of the opportunity to fail and learn from a failure.
Yes. And that's what
when the consequences are
smaller. And that's what we tell parents. Like, you would rather them fail and get back up and continue on and make amends or take the consequence or whatever happens and come out on the other side now when they're in a K through 12 setting than when it's a permanent record type situation.
Yeah. Do you ever have to punt a parent? Like, do you ever have to have a conversation with a parent that includes, hey, your kid can't go here anymore if we don't get this resolved?
We have. I've only had that a couple of times. The most common one, which this one's probably the harder one for me, is for parents that don't want to admit there's an issue with their child academically, like as far as like a learning challenge, like dyslexia or dysgraphia or something that's preventing them from, because they need services, like they need to go to academic language therapy or tutoring or something. But the parent has blinders on and will not concede that there's any issue. And so for a while, we always approach it at first like, these are the things we're noticing. Have you noticed these struggles at home when you're working with them and gathering information? But it does take its toll on the child. And so by third and fourth grade, that child's just swimming, trying to keep above as the coursework gets harder and the requirements. And so then we have to get a little bit more like, we're doing your child a disservice if we don't tell you, like, they need help.
Yeah.
They need academic support. And, I think sometimes reading filters into every subject, like everything, whether it's a scientific report or whatever, you have to be able to read and understand what you've read. And so it's really hard when you get into third, fourth, fifth grade and above, a lot of our science vocabulary and stuff, they don't have a context for, right? Because it's not words you commonly encounter.
Right.
So I remember my child that has dyslexia, one time she was like, that science test was crazy. Like the multiple choice answers were the same exact word. And I was like, come again? And she was like, yeah, they were like hydro this, hydro that. Well, it was hydro and hydra, but it's very hard to distinguish the difference and differentiate when you have dyslexia and the prints close together and there's multiple answers and all of those things. And so up until then, a lot of people, they can get by. But then when you get to more content specific vocabulary that's specific to biology or specific to chemistry, and there's a lot of roots and prefixes and all of that, it becomes more difficult. And so first we try to see, like, it's not helpful to your child. It's not about putting a label. And I think a lot of parents still get hung up because in way back when, before we were more knowledgeable, there was a big thing with labeling kids and put them in special ed and all of those things. Well, that doesn't happen anymore for like dyslexia and all that because like as they're estimating upwards of 20% of people now have it.
Have dyslexia?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is
So
that because the testing has changed and now they're getting more positives in that testing? Or is it because something's changing in the
I think it's a little bit of both. I
Okay.
think we're better at diagnosing early.
Mhm.
Because most students with dyslexia, if they get tested and identified in first to second grade and go through remediation, like they can really do very well by the time they get to middle school and
Uh-huh.
need very little support because you're just retraining those pathways in their brain to recognize and distinguish between the sounds and all of that. The longer it goes, the brain's not as malleable.
Yeah.
And so it's harder to make those gains. So I think we're better about getting them identified early. The flip side is some school districts, though, they don't want to identify because they have to then by law provide services and they don't have the dyslexia personnel and staff to provide the services for 1 in 5.
Oh, what a problem.
What a problem. So that's where it gets sticky and that's where you have 8th graders that can't read.
Mm.
And so, I think I always try to approach it to parents like, I've been in your shoe. Like, I know it would be so easy to bury your head in the sand and think like, oh, he just needs a little more time. She just needs a little more time.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is time is of the essence. Like we need to intervene now. We need to get the support and then they will be golden.
Yeah.
They will do great. And this is not a reflection of IQ. Dyslexia has nothing to do with your IQ. Actually, our students with dyslexia and people in our population with dyslexia are outside the box thinkers. There are entrepreneurs, there are engineers, all of those things because they can look at things from many different views because they've had to. Like their coping strategies are amazing.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's super interesting. And so a lot of our artists or engineers will have dyslexia. And it's very fascinating to me. And so we always tell our students like the things that seem important right now won't seem important when you get older. Like you'll find your niche and all this stuff about reading aloud or nobody cares.
Right.
When have you asked to read aloud? No, never. And stuff. So you just have to get through this time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to do like what you're great at and what your gifting's in. And you'll excel in that area. But for parents, there does come a time where it's like we can't send them on because it's not fair to them that you're not willing to get them services and or acknowledge what's happening and they don't understand why all their peers are passing them by. And so we've had a couple of instances where we've had to have the hard conversation like we can't take them back next year because we're not serving them well.
Yeah.
And kind of force their hand basically because we know hopefully if they put them in the school districts around or wherever, they're going to flag right away.
Yeah.
And then they'll be required to get services.
Yeah.
And then only one time in my building with the pre-K through 4th grade, we've had a situation where we had, and it really wasn't the kids. The kids were really great kids, but the parents, the mom in particular, it was just too much. And just very like critical and emailing teachers to the point that our teachers were getting beat down and like we had to intervene and say, just send the emails to us.
Yeah.
And, critical of every single, like there was just nothing you could do. Or we had a parents' night out that they sponsored for the social club. So it was purely optional, but they signed up and the movie was advertised. They were going to show and do pizza for a kids' night out. And so she was very upset, even though she chose and knew the movie ahead of time. She said the movie ended up scaring her kids. And so, but it just trickled onto everything to where I finally had to say, you know what? I just don't think we're going to be able to meet your expectations or that this is going to be a situation where you're ever going to feel content and happy.
Yeah.
And we can't continue to put our teachers and staff through this who are trying really hard to meet these expectations, but it doesn't seem to be enough.
They're very hard conversations for us to have when we have to fire a client.
Yeah.
And usually it's only when we've given some kind of warning shots.
Yes.
Not like line in the sand, you do this
Right.
or else, but like you You want to give somebody an awareness
Yes.
and allow for the potential for them to course correct and just realize, oh yeah, they're probably right.
Right.
But after you've done that and it doesn't course correct, typically it gets worse.
Yes.
And then it becomes an easy decision.
Yeah.
It's still hard.
It's
And I'm
still
sure
hard.
it's way harder if it's
And it was
you're firing a student
yes.
or the student's parents.
Well, and it's hard in that situation because you feel sorry for the kids.
Yeah, right.
But it was just one of those situations where it was like every week we were drawing straws to see who would answer the email.
Yeah.
And so it just wasn't a healthy climate for anyone. And that's what we had to say. Like, it's not, we don't want teachers that are afraid to open their inbox. Like, we're all for constructive conversations and, how we can best serve. But when every single thing every week is offensive, or you don't like how something was handled or how this person that's just, if you're looking to be offended, you're going to be offended, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's amazing the similarities in what we have with bad clients, where if you do something habitually enough, when your ticket comes in now, it's going to be really hard for me to get somebody on the team that wants to pick that ticket up and take care of you. And when everything that doesn't go perfectly is met with a reminder that, hey, we're just going to fire y'all if you can't get this figured out, it's not worth my staff's mental well-being to be walking on eggshells, because they're not going to do their best work for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody's nervous.
Very similar to what you deal with.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that it's easier for you to make those calls, given you don't have to make them that often, but to make those calls when your school is growing and you have more families that are wanting to send their kids there than you actually have room to grow.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit, specifically what I know happened around the COVID era with the school. Can you talk about how those 2 years or whatever changed the school?
Yes. So that was very interesting because, there was murmurings before spring break in 2020.
It was like March timeframe.
Yep, it was March, and I had a senior that year in high school and a senior in college, and so we were getting towards the end of February, and we were hearing about COVID like from far off, but it wasn't in our back door. But you could tell things were ramping up, and I remember thinking, I started paying more attention, and something was telling me like, this is going to become a deal. And so before we left for spring break, I called my teachers into a faculty meeting, and I said, here's the plan. If for some reason we don't come back after spring break, and they're like, that's crazy, they would never close schools down. I said, okay, I know it sounds crazy, guys. I said, but here's our virtual schedules. This is the platform we're going to use. I've set y'all all up an account. This is how I see the day going, where we give kids time to work. We come back and instruct, like all of those things. I had binders for everybody already made up, everything before we left for spring break. And they were like, we'll see you after spring break. I said, I hope so.
What was it that gave you the spidey sense that was coming?
I kind of felt like the urgency was changing in the messaging that we were hearing. And then I just felt like there's been so many people before that were like, I don't know how you knew, because I really did think you were crazy. And I was like, I know, it sounded so weird to have everybody in there before spring break and everything. And then, after spring break, we never went back. And so we were like, LISD and all that, I think they took 2 or 3 weeks to try to figure out. Well, we never missed a day. When we came back for spring break, we got on virtually. We sent our stuff out to parents and we got on. And so our kids didn't have any decline.
Was there any pushback at that point from parents? Like, LISD is still trying to figure it out, so why are we going remote? Or did parents pretty much know at that point?
Well, no, LISD didn't do anything, like no education for 3 weeks.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Governor Abbott shut us down. We couldn't meet. So there was no option to go in.
Gotcha.
So that mandate came out that at first it was like for 2 weeks. And so I think LISD thought it was only going to be for 2 weeks. So they didn't even try to get something up and going. So kids just had a 3-week spring break. But like so our kids, especially the older ones, were like, why are we doing work? Like everybody else is off
Right.
and stuff. But we just kept plugging along our objectives and kept going. Then as we got to the end of the 2 weeks, that's when they said through May.
Mm.
And so then LISD was scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, how do we educate these mass numbers virtually? What about like families that don't have access to technology, to like they had huge things. But we just stuck to our plan. And so we finished on time, like everybody did all their coursework and things like that. So the biggest pushback we got so obviously there was a lot of uncertainty, and that would have typically been our re-enrollment and enrollment of new family period. So we saw a lot of families, just pull out because they were like, this is so uncertain. Like, we don't really know where this is going. There was a lot of, since there was so much unknown right then, there was so much fear going around. And so I really felt like we did a lot more parenting during that time than we did teaching. And parenting parents, like, your kids should not be watching the news with you. If you and your husband are concerned, I know there's a lot of concerns, they shouldn't be in the room when the grown-up conversations are being had. And that's why we see this bump in anxiety in kids now. And so I think we did a lot of that and a lot of coaching and those kinds of things. But I think the biggest thing was when during the summer, I guess we got towards July. Well, then we saw an influx because Leander wasn't going to go back right away, and we were.
So you had already made the decision at that point that summer, we're going to go back in. Well,
because they came out with that if you were a private school, a private religious school, Ken Paxton came down and said that they can't mandate that you can't start school. So we looked at things, and we had been working all summer, and we were like, we feel like that this is going to do more damage to kids being sequestered at home and on video all day long than if we come back. So we changed how we did recess lunch. There was no big lunchroom anymore. There was no multiple grades at recess. And we made every class its own little pod. And so they ate together, they played together, only, those 12 to 14 kids. And they didn't interact with other things. And and then we always said, like, if we, got above like 4 or 5 cases, then we'd have to shut down for 2 or 3 days. I think it helped to us too that since we were on a hybrid schedule, we naturally had the building empty Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So everything was sanitized, germs were gone. We had air purifiers in every room. Like at the end of every day, everything was sanitized. And we told parents at the time, like, if your child's exhibiting symptoms, obviously keep them at home. They can jump on online for that day. And parents were great about that because they knew, like, that's what it's going to take to keep the school open. So, we did have like 2 or 3 families that were irate that we were opening. But then you had the rest that were like, thank God. And we got a ton of new families for several reasons. One, like, the parents were expected to go back to work, and so they needed their child in something. But the second interesting thing was a lot of parents realized what was being taught or what was happening in education that had never been involved before, because suddenly they were home with their kids online, hearing teachers, hearing curriculum that had never been a part of that equation before. And so
they were having their eyes open to what had been going on the whole time. They were just blind to it.
And they were like,
before.
Some were like, they're not getting an education. Like, this is crazy and all of that. So that made them look for alternatives. So there was a twofold thing happening. But for sure, we had a couple of, I would say a handful of families that were like, I cannot believe you're opening. Like, that's unchristlike. You're not thinking about others, pulling that whole card. And stuff. And we just had to say, you're welcome to follow along. You get to see all the lesson plans, all the homework. You're welcome to stay home and follow along and just turn your work in. Like, we're not forcing you to come back. But we are saying that long term, we feel like this is the healthiest and the best thing. Obviously, if we have an outbreak, we're going to whatever. And I don't think we ever had more than 1 or 2 cases.
Wow.
And kids were back. I mean, our parents said, like, this is really like our city on a hill is what it feels like, because things were still so shut down. And they're like, this is our one slice of normalcy for the kids. And to come here and to see them happy again and stuff. But we did have several kids that you knew had been privy to conversations. Like we had, I'll never forget, it was about a year later, we had a petting zoo come to school. And so they were passing around the little bunnies and chicks and guinea pigs and all of that. And one of the, a child just came into the library and then they got sick. They threw up or whatever. And I meant it was just run of the mill kid like stuff. It wasn't like a bad illness or anything, but another student, like I was like, what's happening over here? She was so upset we had to actually send her home because she was afraid she was going to get COVID because that little girl
that kid
threw up.
Ugh.
And she was like shaking, like she couldn't be in the office because she was afraid that little girl had been sent down there. She couldn't be, she was like paralyzed.
Yeah.
And so we saw that, and we saw an increase in anxiety and stuff like that. And certainly, you know, it was everywhere. The messaging was everywhere. It was really hard to keep your kids from hearing the fear and all of those things. But, you know, I was just, you know, we didn't wear masks. That was a big thing. And, but again, from a reading perspective, and we have preschool, so we have 3s and 4s, for them not to be able to read facial expressions, like a lot of kids that are on the spectrum or just don't have that awareness, social awareness, they rely on looking at a teacher's face to see, oh, should I be doing that? Should I not be doing that? Or whatever.
Learning to make sounds with your mouth too is a lot of like seeing how that person makes their mouth move.
Exactly. Enunciating and all of those things. And so that's where we just really kept the pod, you know, thing tight. And the funny thing was all of our teachers did great. And then we're off for a month at Christmas. Well, several of our teachers, the ones that got COVID, got it when they weren't in school. Which was funny because I think their net was wider then and everything like that. But we did really well as a school and weathered that and felt like we continued to provide an education and really a more healthy atmosphere to balance what was happening in our world at that time.
Yeah, we could spend an entire hour talking about that topic alone.
Yeah.
Like what happened during the COVID years. And I don't remember what I was listening to earlier, but the person was talking about back in the COVID area, back when COVID was happening. And you realize like COVID's still a thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think we really have fully reckoned with what those 2 years did to us as a people globally.
No.
Like the PTSD gets thrown around a lot, but it had a big impact on people and the way that we function and the way that we raise our kids.
Well, and just I think a positive thing, like I think about a simple thing. I used to go to Target all the time. Well, when I wasn't going to stores and was ordering things online, I got out of the habit and realized I don't really need to go to Target. I mean, there was nothing. I made it all that time without going.
We never go into HEB anymore.
I know. So it changed your buying habits. It changed your needs versus wants situation. So there were some of those things as well. But I definitely think, you know, our seniors do a senior thesis every their senior year. And so when Hadley was picking her topics, and I kind of wish she would have picked the other one, but the one of hers was, because that's the field she wants to go into, as a behavior analyst. So working with kids with autism or different, you know, behavioral disorders. But one of them was, and she's big into ASL. That was her foreign language she did. So she can be pretty fluent in ASL? Sign language, American Sign Language. So she was wanting to know, did we learn anything from making preschoolers wear masks during that time, and how now they've come out and say the speech delays are years, and that now we even in the pediatric world changed our benchmarks to where there's certain sounds they should have said. Well, after COVID, we made it later. And so her thing was, did we learn from that? Like if COVID happened again or a new virus tomorrow, would we still repeat those same behaviors, knowing that it damaged a whole generation of preschoolers in their language development. And then her other one was just on ABA therapy and that controversy, and so she chose that one. But I thought the other one would have been interesting to see, like, what did we take away, and from purely data, not feelings, but the data, would we make better decisions next time?
Yeah, hindsight is 20/20, and you would like to think that we learn lessons quickly when we have the benefit of hindsight. But you get the sense, particularly with COVID response and what sort of happened to us as a culture during that time, that the story that history will tell of leadership that we had during those 2 years, it won't be kind to us.
No. And there was so much shaming going on.
Yeah, still
is. Yeah.
The nature of your profession in education, you mentor a lot of people. Who mentors you?
Well, I do have several principals that I still keep in touch with that both in a public and private schools that I like to bounce things off of. I feel like I do a lot of listening to kind of the full circle. So from people in higher ed to other private institutions to public institutions, and belong to a lot of groups and things like that, that it's kind of interesting once you listen again. There's things that make me stop and think about, like, okay, that's an interesting point. Like, is that something that I could implement, and I'd love to see, like, the results of that, like with faculty or staff or those kinds of things. And just kind of, there's a lot of things we do for accreditation or we need to do for accreditation, but my big thing is I don't want to do something to check a box. Like, accreditation is supposed to be about continuous improvement and making your school better, making your faculty better, like all of those things. So I'm always interested, how do other people do it and get buy-in from their staff to make them realize, like, oh, my principal's not making me do another thing, but like, oh, this could really improve learning for students.
The why behind what you're doing.
And so I feel like that there's a lot of great administrators in many different walks of life that look at things from many different avenues because of either the population they've served or different things that really, to me, provide a lot of value when I'm thinking about, like, how to approach something or what I would like to take away or do. I think the hardest thing for me is, at the end of the day, realizing, like, everybody's not going to feel as passionate about something as I am. And I think that's one reason that, which kind of also can contribute to that burnout feeling. But like, I've always felt a tremendous burden for, like, especially the kids that we serve, like, their education. And that's why I think we talked about it before. Like, I am super frustrated with private schools that call themselves a private school but don't hold up the standards of providing a quality education. I'm from the mindset that every school that's going to provide an education should be accredited. There has to be checks and balances because you are impacting someone's life for their whole future. And self-esteem and all of those things as they get older and feel like they can't operate in the same way peers or colleagues, or they never were taught that, or those kinds of things. And so I've always taken that on, but I realize, and it shouldn't be that way, and you don't want it that way. And for the most part, I would say we don't experience that at Sterling because of our hybrid model. Most of our faculty and staff are there because, like me, they are passionate about education and they like this work-life balance. Like, the hybrid model lets them not give up their whole life, but they can still do what they're passionate about.
Sure.
But I will say the teachers that I feel like are just there for a check usually don't last in our model. Because it does require an investment. You have small classes, you form relationships with parents, but that's a huge really burden I've always felt is like I'm impacting these students for the rest of their lives. Like the accountability I provide to teachers and our curriculum and all those things like is very important. But at some point you have to realize not everybody shares that passion.
Yeah. I'm always interested to hear how people at the top of an organization answer that question about mentorship, because it's one of the inherent risks you run being the top person is that it's obvious the role you're playing in mentoring people on your team to do their job better, but it's not always obvious where you're getting that sort of influence yourself. And it doesn't really always come from the people that you're surrounded with on the team. It's usually you have to make an effort to get it from somewhere
outside.
else.
Yes.
So it's parents, it's, colleagues that are in the same position at other schools.
For sure.
It's groups that you're a part of. But if you don't seek those things out, they don't always come to you organically.
No, and I think I always said when I reach the point where I have no desire to learn anything else, then I should be done.
That's the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things on here is like, what's the hallmark for when you need to get off the ride?
Yeah, when I don't feel excited about learning something new, I still am a geek. I love to read curriculum. I love to learn about new books that have come out or, listen to a podcast or TED Talks or all those things. And those things excite me. And I think like, how could that impact our students? What would it change for the better? What would that look like as additional things on our campus? But if I ever get to the point where I'm like, I don't want to hear one more thing, then I know if I'm done learning and growing, then I'm done as an educator.
Yeah, because you're either making progress and growing or you're dying. There's no neutral.
Right.
Yeah. Something I've grown to really appreciate about the Miller-Tyree clan that you come from is the importance that you all place on family. Every birthday is an event.
It is.
It's a reason to get the family together.
Yes.
What characteristics do you possess that came from your mom?
That's a hard one because I would say I was raised with a tremendous work ethic, but on both sides. And definitely that commitment and willingness to go the extra mile is from mom because she was up at the crack of dawn, like my whole life, would leave and go into the office and get home after dark. And I would ride with her a lot into Hyde Park because it was 5 minutes away, her work was, until I started driving and those kinds of things. And then, she would stay in it for play practice, but sometimes she'd go back and work a couple of hours while I was there. So, and she would take work home. So I definitely think that I got that value that, some jobs aren't 8 to 5 and that, you do whatever it takes to get a job done.
Yeah.
Kind of mentality.
The willingness to do more than what is required.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I would also say Dad always worked an extra job with the air conditioning. I meant, up until way past retirement.
Right. Up until recently. Yeah.
And so, both of them just had incredible work ethics. But I will say growing up, even though they were busy and they worked, we always had summer vacations that my dad usually planned with his Randy McNally Atlas 6 months in advance. And
so he's always been wired that way.
He's always been wired, and that's where I get it with the trip planning.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, where do you favor your dad?
Oh, yeah,
that explains
it. That's it. Yeah, planning a trip and figuring out the mileage, all of that kind of stuff. I'm all for that, and so I feel like both of those things really set me up where I could do hard things. I knew that
starting a school,
and that you're going to be uncomfortable sometimes. That was really the thing. In our house, things might be uncomfortable, but it was whatever it is, you pull yourself up and you just power through.
Yeah.
And stuff. Whereas I feel like today, sometimes we kind of go the opposite way. We're oh, it might not be right if it's feeling uncomfortable, which that's not always accurate.
It's also not the way the world works.
Right.
Yeah.
So I definitely feel like that. I also feel like they were big on family and traditions.
Yeah. Traditions.
Very big on traditions. And I was just thinking about that recently, because, moms, had said, like, if you or Sherry want to take over Thanksgiving or Christmas. So I just barely mentioned that to like Drew, and he was like, why would we not go to Mima's for Thanksgiving? Like, that's our tradition.
Yeah.
That's what he said. And I was like, well, the tradition is still getting together as a family. The location may change,
Yeah.
but I do see now how even having married children, the importance we placed on traditions has bled through to them.
Yeah.
And they place that priority on those kinds of things and stuff. So, you know, I feel like I was very fortunate that I definitely have a driven spirit about me that I've always had, but my parents weren't overbearing or helicopter in any way. Like when I look back, whatever I wanted to pursue, I pursued. And, you know, I filled out my own college applications and they were like, let us know what you need from us. But like, I just took care of it and did it. But I think a lot of that was just, again, I didn't realize there was any other way. Like I'd always seen people that just did whatever it took to get what we needed or, you know, to provide for our family and those kinds of things. So it just kind of was second nature.
Ashton and I talked about that this morning, like the things that we recognize about our childhood that were, you could look at it as a bug or you could look at it as a feature.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we both possess, that sort of self-starter thing, maybe is not a result of something that our parents did intentionally.
Right.
It was like an unintentional side effect that was positive of the way that we were raised. Yeah, it's cool. I see all those things with your parents. I've been fortunate to get to know them both.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question that I have asked basically everybody I've had in here, and you have a unique perspective on it given your proximity to kids. There's no shortage of pessimism, particularly when talking about the next generation. You know, and that's kind of always been the case, like kids these days is a quip, right? So there's no, it's not hard to find things to be pessimistic about the future. What do you see in the next generations of kids that you interact with that make you optimistic?
I think the biggest asset we have in the kids moving forward is that they have broadened their horizons or the things, like they're much more vested in current events. And I also think that they're more knowledgeable, and at least the kids I interact with, because we're a very Socratic discussion school, so kids are required to come to the table with ideas and toss them around. I see very smart, articulate students that are able to really, you know, delve into the why behind things. And I think that we're going to need passionate people in different parts to really, you know, keep advancing things and to stand up for things and all of that. So I think that it's neat that kids are looking at different areas to go into, different ways to serve. I think it's neat that we are placing a little bit more on thinking about equipping kids with, you know, like, where are your interests, but, you know, where do you feel gifted to serve or where do you feel drawn? And I think, you know, again, we need to put more emphasis. Not everybody's path has to be college. I meant trade school, trades. I meant if you try to get anything fixed, there's a wait.
Yeah.
And, you know, some kids, like college, they could use their gifts in many other ways. And college is just not something they're super interested in. And so instead of forcing something and maybe, you know, getting into debt over something where they could have a great living and provide well for their family and learn a trade, like I think we have to, as a society, encourage these next generation, like you have this whole buffet to choose from. Like it doesn't just have to be this one path.
Especially given the amount that the value proposition for higher education has changed.
Yes.
And it's definitely not for all kids.
No, and we have to, I feel like college counselors in high schools sometimes do a disservice by not telling kids the reality of it. Look, this is what are you looking to do with this degree?
Yeah.
Okay, let's look it up. How many jobs are hiring for that exact thing right now?
Right.
Like, and what are they paying? And do you really need the education for that? Or is it something that, if you kind of pivoted and got a more broader degree or got a minor, that it would give you 6 different avenues to pursue. Like, I think we have to kind of guide students and equip them with more information before they make that decision, because all families are different for the ability to help their kids pay for college and all of that. And it was important to us that, like, our kids didn't start out their life with debt and stuff, but that's harder and harder to do. For a lot of
I'd say
families.
that's a selling feature of a smaller classroom environment too.
Yes.
Is that you can have a more intimate relationship with that kid, where when the time comes for them to decide, what am I going to do after that senior year, there's going to be a subset of those kids that like, boy, you could really excel in a trade.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't think that it's just a foregone conclusion that you've got to go $100,000 in debt going to college.
Exactly. Well, the other day we were laughing because we had some toilets that were keeping on running or something, and one of our seniors took the jump thing off of his key and fixed 2 toilets. and we were like, okay, well, sometimes you don't get your assignments turned in, but on time.
But you can do that.
Look at what you can do. Like, have you thought about other trades or other things? Like, if that interests you, taking stuff apart and putting it back together.
Yeah. And you'll always have a job.
Yeah,
definitely. Sonya, we breezed through an hour really quickly. We just did an hour and 10. And there was probably half of the things that I wrote down that I would talk to you about that maybe we can do it again in the future.
I would love it.
Thank you for taking time to do this. Thank you for plugging me back in with your family when Ashton wouldn't talk to me.
Yes.
But yeah, I've enjoyed the shared experience that we've had talking about leadership of the organizations that we both represent. It's been a fun nuance to some of the family functions where I can be like, hey, what's going on at the school? And you're asking me what's going on at Live Oak. It's added a cool family dynamic to those things.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
I appreciate that too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for taking time for me.
Yeah, thanks.